You're listening to the ATS Breathe Easy podcast, brought to you by the American Thoracic Society.
Welcome, listeners, to the ATS Breathe Easy podcast. My name is Gary Ewart, and I'm Chief for Advocacy and Government Relations for the American Thoracic Society. And it's my privilege to host today's episode titled ATS Clean Air in the Courts, where we will be discussing recent policy action that ATS has taken to keep the air we all breathe pollution-free. I am pleased to be joined today by my colleagues, Nick Nassikas, who's a member of the ATS Environmental Health Policy Committee and a clinician and researcher at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and Andrew Mergen, who is the faculty director of the Emmett Environmental Law and Policy Clinic at the Harvard University Law School. Welcome to you both. Let's jump right in. Nick, how bad is air pollution?
Yeah, so I would like to lead off by just saying that decades of research has made it clear that bad air is bad for your health. And what does that mean? It means that the research that we've done so far has shown that breathing in polluted air shortens life expectancy, impairs lung function, causes and exacerbates cardiopulmonary disease. So that's settled science. What we're also starting to understand is that the changes in our climate, rising temperatures, have also led to more extreme weather events. And there's a clearer picture now that that also has implications for a lot of our patients with chronic pulmonary disease. And then the kind of future, what that looks like, is starting to understand how the warmer temperatures interact with some of the air pollution that we're seeing and how that together can cause problems for our patients. It's not all grim, though. There's also a lot of science and evidence out there that shows that when we do something about it, when we implement policies and regulations, we actually can help improve the health of people across the world.
So, Nick, I got to say, I always get a little worried when people say it's settled science. Give me a study that makes it so crystal clear that you can take it to the skeptic and say, this study makes it obvious to anyone who's really paying attention that clean air good, dirty air bad.
So I think if you look at any single study, there's always something that you can pull out that says, here's a weakness, here's a limitation, here's why the results of this study might not be generalizable to your state, your community, your country, your corner of the world. So one of the things that I think is a really great resource is some of the studies that have been published out there, or some of the reports that have been published out there that take all of the science that's been published and say, okay, here are all the studies that we've done so far. What does it tell us? And one of the, I think, cornerstones of this sort of work was actually done by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And if I think about choosing one particulate, air pollutant in particular, it's particulate matter. And so the EPA publishes something called the Integrated Science Assessment that takes all the science that we've gathered so far, puts it into one place and says, okay, looking at all this science, what can we say? And it's clear from that report that air pollution causes mortality. So that science is settled.
Okay, you've used another buzzword that I want to follow up on. You said causes mortality. How do we know it causes mortality? Because in the world that we all operate in, causality is a pretty strong thing and requires a lot of evidence. All right, walk me to causality.
So what establishing causality looks like is taking epidemiology, which is looking at associations on a population level. It's taking studies that are looking at mechanisms. So sometimes those are studies that are done in mouse populations or in human populations. And it's taking all of those different types of studies and putting them together to make an inference about causality. Now, in the science world, oftentimes we get to causality through randomized control trials to say this drug can reduce the risk of death, or if you take this medicine, it'll cause you to feel better. This is a little bit different than what we're talking about here. Here we're saying that air pollution is a problem for public health. How do we know that air pollution itself causes mortality? There we really rely on the burden of evidence that's been published so far.
Andy, I'm convinced. Are you convinced?
I am convinced. Yes.
Okay. So what authorities do we have at the federal level to do something about this?
We have a lot of authority in the Clean Air Act, enacted in 1970, substantially amended to make it more stringent in 1977 and 1990. The Clean Air Act empowers the Environmental Protection Agency in cooperation with the states to regulate both stationary and mobile sources of pollution. So power plants, vehicles, trucks, cars, airplanes, and and in addition to sort of those pollutants, but also sort of air toxics, things like mercury that are discharged from power plants. The authority has the agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, has considerable authority to regulate the air pollution that affects our health.
So I'm going to ask a somewhat leading question. So this is federal authority done with the states. Are all states equal, or is there one state that might have a little more sway in this process than others?
No, all the states, they regulate under a plan, a regime created by the Clean Air Act, and they deal like some sources of pollution are heavily localized, and the Act allows states to deal with their own sort of geographies and pollution sources, and the Act also deals with a situation where some states may be the center of power plants, and other states may be downwind of those power plants. So the Act also contemplates that the states will be good neighbors to each other. So each state is somewhat different in terms of the sources of the pollution and how that pollution manifests itself in particular geographies. But the Act gives states and the federal government a lot of authority to deal with that pollution.
Okay, it sounds like the states and the federal government do have a lot of authority to address our air quality. Tell me, what's the Trump administration doing with that authority?
The Trump administration is in the midst of a massive deregulatory moment. It is stripping EPA or attempting to strip EPA of its authority and limiting its authority to regulate a wide an enormous number of air pollutants. It is walking back the mercury and air toxic standards. It is walking back carbon pollution standards. It proposes to rescind the greenhouse gas endangerment finding. All of these things that the administration is proposing to do will dramatically affect public health. That's Nick's area, but these are incredibly aggressive, ambitious deregulatory actions that are going to impact public health.
Early bird registration for ATS 2026 in Orlando is now open. Register now and save. Members get a discount, so become an ATS member or renew your membership to take advantage of the savings. Visit conference.thoracic.org today.
Nick, you want to comment on what some of the fears are? Because when I hear deregulation, it sounds like, oh, profits go up and my retirement savings will just bump up and everyone will be happy. Why might this be something, a moment of concern for both Andy and Nick and the greater population?
Yeah, so what people might not realize is how important some of these federal agencies have been for public health. If you think about OSHA and the EPA and the CDC, a lot of these maybe obscure federal agencies for a lot of people have actually played an outsized role in protecting our public health. And so anytime you look at stripping some of these agencies of their ability to regulate air pollutants, it's concerning for public health. And so I think if you go back decades when our water was dirty, our air was dirty, and you look at all that we've achieved over the past few decades with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, we really are living in a better world now than we did before. And it would just hate to see us go backwards, take a step backwards.
Okay. So Andy just outlined a number of steps that the administration has taken to roll back clean air regulations. Nick, how's the ATS responding to them?
Yeah, so the ATS has really been a leader on this front. And one of the things that ATS has been doing is keeping a really close eye on what are the specific actions on the regulatory level, on the policy level, that are being reconsidered or revoked, and what does that mean for public health? And in response, looking at these different changes by the administration, we've really set up a way of tackling these. First, it's through amicus briefs, and that involves considering where the science is and how it supports the laws that we have, and we can talk a little bit more about that. It also involves, providing expert testimony for either preserving or reconsidering different regulatory things that are on the table. There's also a lot of research and advocacy work that the ATS does, and so they've really been a leader on this front.
So, Andy, I just heard a phrase that most people aren't familiar with, and the pressing question is it pronounced amicus brief or amicus brief?
So Black's Law Dictionary, which is sort of a definitive resource for lawyers, all lawyers are familiar with Black's, says that either pronunciation is correct.
I am relieved.
Amicus or amicus. I tend to say amicus. Others, I heard Dr. Nassikas say amicus. Either is proper under Black's Law Dictionary.
Now that we have that essential legal matter settled, what is an amicus or an amicus brief, and why do we care?
Yeah, so an amicus brief is a friend of the court brief. Amicus from the Latin, like amigo, it's your friend. And it's intended to help the court address the legal issues in front of it. Briefs, amicus briefs from organizations like ATS really play an important function in terms of putting together in a straightforward manner the science that underlies some of these rules, the health effects that that have been studied and verified, and help the court understand what this regulation means in the real world. And they have a long history. Some of your listeners may have heard of Justice Brandeis, Louis Brandeis. He was an advocate before he was a justice, and he was famous as an advocate for one, representing people who needed legal representation for free, and preparing these briefs that are now sort of called Brandeis briefs that incorporate science and social science to educate courts. And in 1908, he submitted a brief on the effect of work hours on the health of women, what it meant to be standing on your feet 12 hours a day and doing certain types of work. And over time, the courts have recognized that this kind of information it can be very helpful to understanding the issues. And amicus briefs are filed routinely in the Supreme Court and very, very often in federal courts of appeals and occasionally in federal district courts, and also very often in state courts of appeals and state Supreme Courts. And the evidence really is that they can be very helpful. They have to be carefully crafted to be helpful, but they can be helpful.
Okay, who reads them?
I'd say in the first instance, the clerks. What does that mean? Each judge on a court has helpers. Those helpers are recent law school graduates, and their job is to digest a lot of the information that's put before the judge. So in the first instance, these briefs are likely to be read by the clerks, and the clerks will flag issues for the judge. Some judges are going to read them themselves, and some are going to delegate that task. But that's one immediate audience, right? And that's the audience that you're trying to affect. You're trying to get the court to rule in your favor. They're also going to be read by your opponents and your allies. And I'll just say a word about that. When we work with ATS, which it has been our great privilege to do on amicus briefs, we're always very careful to communicate with the coalition of folks looking at challenging these regulations or defending Clean Air Act regulations to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the message and the strategy for winning. Lawyers also are, I think, sometimes informed by the notion, do no harm. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do with amicus briefs. We're trying to win the case and present in coalition with our partners a winning strategy.
So this question is to both Andy and Nick. We're talking about amicus briefs for a reason, and that's because the ATS has recently submitted a couple amicus briefs in some important challenges to the Clean Air Act, either pushing regulations forward or pulling regulations back. Nick, Andy, can you walk us through a couple of the more recent cases the ATS has filed amicus briefs in?
Sure, I can talk about one that we're working with our Harvard colleagues at the Emmett Environmental Law Policy Clinic, including Andy, who leads that group. The main one is the greenhouse gas endangerment finding. So what does that mean? What is the endangerment finding? And I think the best way to think about this is greenhouse gases are labeled an air pollutant, and therefore the EPA is required to regulate them. So it's basically a way of giving the EPA an ability to regulate our greenhouse gases because they're labeled an air pollutant. What does that mean for public health? Well, we know that greenhouse gases cause our planet to get warmer. A warmer planet means more wildfires, more extreme weather, more hurricanes, more droughts and fluctuations in extreme precipitation. And this all has impacts for our patients. And so we really need a mechanism to help regulate those air pollutants so we can do something about climate change. And there's been real world impacts with this greenhouse gas endangerment finding. And I think one clear example is regulating tailpipe emissions from vehicles. In the regulatory impact assessment that was published by the EPA for the greenhouse gas endangerment finding, they found that this could lead to $2.1 trillion in economic savings over 30 years. So there's economic benefits and there's also public health benefits. And I think the other way to think about this is doing nothing doesn't feel like the right move. And so this is a way for the EPA really to tackle one of our world's pressing issues.
Andy, what would you like to add?
Well, I think of course, I agree with everything that Nick has said. Almost a year ago, we filed a brief on behalf of ATS on the greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy duty vehicles, which I think that brief also sort of really illustrates the important role that ATS can play in getting information before the court in terms of what these standards mean for public health. It is labeled a greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy duty vehicles. This is exactly what the administration is in the process of trying to roll back or considering rolling back. And you would think, well, it sounds like the rule is really focused on greenhouse gases and climate change writ large. But as Nick has so eloquently explained, these gases have really meaningful effects on public health in the here and now. And I think the briefs that ATS can file makes that point. This isn't just about some abstraction with glaciers melting in Greenland and sea level risings. This is about human health effects in the here and now.
So, Andy, I got to ask, why is an accomplished lawyer like you in an esteemed program like the Harvard Environmental Law and Policy Clinic doing legal work for the ATS pro bono?
Law clinics like ours, and there are many excellent law clinics across the country, give law students the opportunity to walk out of a giant classroom where they're listening to a lecture and getting grilled in the Socratic method that's a sort of famous part of legal education, and actually sit down and craft briefs that are going to be filed before courts, and craft briefs with the input of you and Nick and the professionals at ATS. And so this is a long-term gain, I think, both for ATS, which gets free labor under our supervision, and in the long term, you are training up the next set of lawyers who are going to care about these issues and are really going to have benefited from early in their career responding to a client, hearing Nick say, I wouldn't frame it that way, or you need to think about what this study is really saying, is incredibly valuable. And so this is a win-win, and we really appreciate we're happy to do this for free, and we are so grateful that you're willing to trust us to do a good job and help train up the next generation of environmental lawyers.
Thank you, Andy. Nick, can you explain the amicus brief process in collaboration with Andy's group, what it looks like from the ATS side? What is it that you do? What does the ATS contribute to the process?
Yeah, so one of the things I'll say is that for those that haven't been involved in this work, it actually relies on a lot of the skills you already have as a physician, and a lot of the skills that you've gained through medical school training, through residency training, and if you've gone on to fellowship, through fellowship training. And what that primarily is based on is literature review. So what we do is we start with looking at the studies that have been published, ideally in some of the high impact journals, and take that burden of evidence, take all of those different studies and try to pull them together in a way that explains why this policy is important for public health. So if there's a policy that's mostly looking at particulate matter, pulling out the studies that have shown why particulate matter is bad for respiratory health, bad for cardiovascular health, important for reducing for children, and disadvantaged populations. So we pull all of that evidence together and we share it with our colleagues in the different environmental law clinics, who then craft the amicus brief. And then after they've crafted the amicus brief, we then review it and say, okay, here's where we got the science right, or here's where the science that we're describing is not quite worded in the way that I would word it, or maybe we can't be as strong at this recommendation, but maybe here's a study that supports this viewpoint. So it's taking all of the information that we know, talking to experts, getting the different studies and pulling it together so that we have the best science in the brief.
Thank you, Nick. Andy, back to you. We've had the pleasure of working with your clinic a couple times now, including amicus briefs before the U.S. Supreme Court. Let's zoom out for a moment. Am I right in feeling like every legal question these days goes to the Supreme Court? Redraw congressional district, let's talk to the Supreme Court. Vaccine policy, let's talk to the Supreme Court. ICE raids, let's go to the Supreme Court. Is this real? Is this healthy? Is this sustainable?
Yeah, maybe I'll start by saying this. I have been an appellate lawyer, including practicing before the Supreme Court for 35 years. And that practice has changed a lot in the time that I've been practicing, right? This so-called shadow docket, right? This emergency docket, where important rules like the good neighbor rule have been stayed by the Supreme Court. This is somewhat unusual. It's new. There's a lot of change in the air. The legal doctrines that have been in place for a long time, that sort of have guided environmental law for a long time, some of them have been overturned. And so it's a whole new world out there with more and more sort of big matters going to the Supreme Court in a way that they didn't previously. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon. Some of it you can trace back to when the court stayed the Clean Power Plan, right? An early effort. It seems, when I say early, I mean going back to the Obama administration effort to deal with carbon pollution and standards from power plants. So this is a new world, and I don't think it's healthy for the court, which has radically changed the way it has to operate because it's doing so much emergency work, or for litigants. For people who are interested in stability in the law is normally very small c conservative. We operate under precedents, and change generally comes slowly in the law, but now change has come more quickly, and more matters are accelerated to the Supreme Court. And, environmental folks who litigate on behalf of environmental interests, whether that's public health organizations or environmental NGOs or community groups or into some businesses and industries, are very mindful of the fact that the court seems to be involved earlier and earlier in every major dispute. And we are in the process of adjusting the way that we think about litigation in light of that facts and that changing circumstance.
Thank you, Andy. Let's zoom back in. Nick, I'm a policy wonk. I could talk about this stuff all day because it's kind of cool and fun. But if the ATS is successful, how do we draw this back to patient care? What will our work in this space have a real world impact on people living and breathing?
I'm sure, like many others who are healthcare professionals, it's every single day I'm seeing patients when they bring up, a lot of my patients have asthma, when they're bringing up something in their environment that's triggering their asthma. And it can be frustrating to sit there and talk about inhalers or changes in therapy when you know the bigger problem is that it's the wildfire smoke that's triggering their asthma, or the extreme heat events that are triggering their asthma, or the wildly fluctuating temperatures that we can see now more frequently. And to be able to focus on policies that specifically target those problems in our environment pulls it back to patient care. So when we're sitting with a patient, we're not just talking about changing our inhaler regimens, but also thinking at a bigger scale, how do we do something about these other environmental exposures? And policy is often the best way to do those things. And really ATS and working with our colleagues in the law clinic is one mechanism for achieving that goal.
So I'm going to ask you this, both of you, this last question. In our current situation and in the context of ATS legal advocacy in the courts, what does winning look like? Nick, I'm going to turn it over for you to respond first.
So I'll answer in two ways. First, I think it's helping people understand how important these potentially obscure agencies can be for protecting human health. The EPA, OSHA, CDC, these are ones that I mentioned earlier. These are really important federal agencies that have done so much to promote public health. And a lot of the regulations and policies that they've implemented have benefited all of us. I think my second answer is that having a cleaner world is just better. It's our health is better. Clean cars, electric cars are just more fun to drive, and our homes aren't threatened by extreme weather events. So I think a cleaner world is just a better world, and I think a lot of us could actually agree on that.
Andy, over to you. Can you top that?
No, I mean, of course, I plus one everything that Nick has just said, and I think that the work that ATS and your members and Nick are doing are so important to educating the public to what's going on. Every time a physician talks to a patient about what is triggering these health problems, and every time we file a brief that has the benefit of educating the court about these connections, I think is really important. I think it's also important to just keep fighting in a strategic way, right, and making good decisions. But I'll just say that some colleagues, some folks that we've worked with in the clinic from Sierra Club just won a big win in a Clean Air Act case in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals having to do with Detroit's ozone state implementation plan. And so victories are possible, but you only win when you're in the fight. And so we have a duty to educate the public and to educate the courts and to keep pressing on these things. The Congress that enacted the Clean Air Act in 1970, I think, would be appalled by what the administration is doing today. And I think most Americans would be appalled once they come to understand like how important these agencies, and I really appreciate Nick mentioning OSHA, our labor agencies. The Environmental Protection Agency has environment in its name, but it's really a public health agency. And I think we need to be thinking of it in that way. Hopefully that would sway some folks who to understand the critical importance of the work of the agency. And ATS is really important in driving those messages home.
Well, Nick, Andy, thank you both for participating in today's Breathe Easy podcast. And more importantly, thank you for the work you're doing in the courts and in the clinics to preserve and improve air quality in the U.S. Any listeners who are interested in learning more about the ATS work or want to get involved in the ATS advocacy work, please send me an email at gewart@thoracic.org. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us today for this ATS Breathe Easy podcast.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more, visit our website at thoracic.org. Find more ATS Breathe Easy podcasts on Transistor, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a show.